She was born into a house where the floorboards knew her name before she did, where her lullabies were not sung but whispered in corners by women who knew what silence cost. She came into the world with skin that glowed like copper beneath candlelight, a mirror of someone else's truth no one dared to speak aloud. No title, no inheritance, but still, a face too familiar to be called nothing. They never spoke her father's name in front of her, but they never had to. She saw it in the way the mistress of the house looked away when she passed, in the way the master's eyes paused too long when they met hers, and in the way the walls never let her forget whose blood she carried. She was taught to be still, to walk softly, to take up space without leaving footprints. Her body was not hers. Her time was not hers. Even her name was a gift she didn't choose, but her mind, that was different. It moved like wind through locked rooms. It listened. It remembered. And it learned that some people wear crowns without needing one on their heads, and some people wear chains that no one sees. When she was 14, they said she would travel, not as a guest, not for leisure, but to serve. And she was sent across the sea to a world of powdered faces and velvet rooms where she poured tea for people who couldn't see her and memorized languages that would never belong to her. There, far from the plantation, far from the red soil that birthed her, she tasted a kind of freedom that almost felt like breathing. Almost. But freedom given can be taken, and hers was never hers to keep. One night, beneath a Paris moon too full to be quiet, he came to her room. Not with cruelty, not with violence, but with the kind of authority that wears charm like a mask and kindness like a leash. He said he cared for her. He said she was beautiful. He said he would never hurt her. And maybe he believed that. But love offered without choice is not love at all. She nodded. She obeyed. Because that's what you do when your body is a border no one lets you guard. They lived like ghosts inside a house that breathed in whispers and bargains. She moved through hallways lined with books about liberty and ink-stained pages that praised freedom while her footsteps echoed in bare feet and borrowed silence. He was powerful, respected, a man who penned philosophies by candlelight, writing of equality while she lay just beyond the reach of his pen. She was not his wife. She was not his servant. She was not his mistress in any name that could be spoken aloud. But still he kept returning, not with violence, not with tenderness, but with something stranger. Expectation. He promised her that if she returned home, her children would be free, not her, them. It was a bargain she didn't want to make, but her womb was no longer hers, and already it had begun to carry a legacy the world would not acknowledge. So she said yes, because she knew what it meant to say no when someone else held your future in their hands. They returned to the land that had claimed her, and just like before, the world closed around her with the sweet rot of familiarity. The house was the same, the faces were the same, but she was not. She had seen Paris, she had tasted air that did not weigh like chains, but now, back among the fields, the stairs, the names she was never allowed to use, she had only one mission: to protect what came next. She bore his children in secret, not because she wanted to hide them, but because the world would never let them be fully born. They lived between names, between rooms, between worlds, too light for the quarters, too dark for the parlor, too loud for silence, too quiet for rage. She raised them with songs hummed into their hair, teaching them to walk with pride in a world that would try to beat it out of them. And he never denied them in private. He never raised a hand. He gave them lessons, books, even gifts, but he never gave them his name. Sometimes she would sit at the edge of the garden as the sun set over Monticello and wonder if this was what love looked like when it wore a mask too heavy to remove. Was it love to be kept in the shadows, to be protected like a secret heirloom never shown to guests? Was it love to be owned? She didn't cry. She didn't scream, because her silence was her survival, and her survival was her resistance. Years passed, not with celebration, but with measured breaths. Children grew in the quiet corners of a grand estate built by hands that were never thanked. She watched them laugh in rooms they couldn't inherit, read books written by men who would never write about them. They asked questions. Why can't we sit at that table? Why do they look at us that way? Why don't we use his name? She answered them with eyes that had seen too much and mouths full of stories she was never allowed to tell. Because we are both of him and not of him. And somehow, they understood. He grew older, grayer, wiser in the ways that made him adored by men who quoted his words but never questioned what he chose to forget. The world praised him as a visionary, a builder, a father of nations, but never asked what kind of father he was to those whose skin carried the parts of him he refused to claim in public. He spoke of liberty on balconies and parchment while she rocked their children to sleep behind doors that history never opened. They called him the architect of freedom, but her hands were the ones that built the future in flesh and blood. Sometimes at dawn she would walk the garden paths before the estate awakened. Just her, the wind, and the roots beneath her feet that carried more truth than any document. She thought about leaving. Once, long ago, but she knew what the world did to women who tried to break free without papers, without protection, without power. She stayed not because she was weak, but because her children deserved whatever safety her presence could buy. She was their shield, their silence, their proof, and though he gave them opportunity, education, and distance, he never gave them recognition. And that silence she carried like stone beneath her ribs. The visitors came to see his books, his maps, his legacy carved in columns. But they never asked about the woman who lived just beyond the light, the one whose room had no portrait, whose name had no plaque, the one who bore 6 children with the man who fathered a nation but refused to call her family. She was there. She was always there. And yet, history chose not to see her. But the garden remembered, the walls remembered, the bloodlines remembered. She lived long enough to see some of her children walk free. Not fully, not equally, but free enough to choose a different name, to move without chains, even if the world still saw them through glass cracked by history. She did not ask for statues. She did not need parades. But she did want one thing, that her children would never be called property again. And so she stayed. She stayed through the stairs, through the silence, through the years. Because sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is to exist and endure in the place that tried to erase you. When he died, they buried him with honor, with marble, with lines carved deep into stone. No mention of her, no mention of them. As if he had lived in a world without shadows. But shadows have names, and hers refused to fade. For years, she was left out of books, out of lectures, out of the memory that built the myth of a flawless founding. But whispers turned into questions, and questions became records, and records became truth. And now, finally, she stands in the story where she always belonged. Her name was Sally Hemings. She was born in 1773 in Virginia. She was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson, and history tells us she bore him 6 children. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence. She was the author of a silent legacy that outlived him. She lived in the shadow of Monticello, not because she chose to, but because she was placed there. And yet her bloodlines carried forward. Some of her descendants passed into whiteness. Some bore her name. Some still fight to see her story told without shame. She never had a crown, but her lineage sat at the table of the most powerful man in America. She never had freedom, but her children inherited its echo. And she never asked to be remembered, but we remember her anyway. Because no empire is complete without the truth it tried to bury. And no throne is ever truly legitimate when it's built on the silence of the woman who bore its future.